For the first time in US history, you're more likely to die of an opioid overdose than in a car crash. The National Safety Council has confirmed those odds, saying the crisis is getting worse because fentanyl is so widely available.
The Department of Homeland Security has announced its new strategy for combating the explosion in opioid overdose deaths, which have been ripping through the country for several years now. Illegal and synthetic fentanyl is now the leading cause of death for Americans between ages 18 to 49 years old, with fatal overdoses surging a stunning 94% between 2019 and 2021. Now look, you're watching the impact synthetic opioids have had in cities like San Francisco, but the city isn't alone in grappling with this epidemic. In 2021 alone, these overdoses killed over 100,000 Americans, translating to more than 270 deaths per day. These are our fellow Americans, okay? Illicit street drugs now claim more lives than car accidents, gun violence, or suicides. So how did we get here? And what's the right response to this increasingly deadly epidemic? It all started with the overprescription of pain medication, something we've covered deeply on this show, detailed reports on this with pharmaceutical companies like Purdue Pharma, for instance, encouraging doctors to dole out scripts while misleading healthcare providers and patients about how addictive the drugs really were. As it became more evident that patients were getting hooked on prescription opioids like OxyContin, the Obama administration decided to act by restricting and regulating painkillers, prosecuting the pharmaceutical companies behind them, and investigating the pill mills that filled the prescriptions. For instance, in 2014, the Drug Enforcement Administration reclassified medications combined with hydrocodone to a more dangerous class of controlled substances, which made it more difficult to prescribe for longer periods of time. In 2016, the CDC issued landmark guidelines for prescribing opioids that recommended 90 milligrams of morphine or their equivalent as a daily ceiling for opioid use against pain. Doctors grew reluctant to prescribe opioids. Frustrated pain patients had trouble filling orders. By the end of 2019, 39 states had enacted laws and regulations limiting the prescribing or dispensing of opioids. Now, that effort seemed to work in regard to opioid prescriptions. Between 2006 and 2012, companies distributed more than 72 billion oxycodone and hydrocodone pills. A subsequent release accounted for an additional 24 billion pills in 2013 and 2014. Data collected by the DEA reveals that the number of prescription hydrocodone and oxycodone pills peaked in 2011 at 12.8 billion pills and then dropped to fewer than 7.1 billion by 2019. Shipments of potent 80 milligram oxycodone pills dropped 92% in 2019 from their peak a decade earlier. So by 2022, the volume of per capita prescription opioid use fell for the 11th straight year to levels not seen since 2000. But as some of you already know, sometimes well-intentioned policy has unintended consequences. In this case, the unintended consequences were the start of an even deadlier drug epidemic. Today, the opioid crisis has morphed into the use of synthetic fentanyl made with precursor chemicals from China, manufactured by drug cartels in Mexico, and smuggled into the United States to devastating effect. The trend began with heroin. And look, what's really important to keep in mind is that even in the early 2010s, as hydrocodone and oxy were still being overprescribed, users were already turning to the street drug because it offered the same euphoric feeling at a fraction of the price. But when fentanyl hit the streets, there was an even cheaper option available, and the restrictions on prescriptions had already begun. That's when overdoses really exploded. Just take a look at this chart, which helps illustrate the dramatic increase in fentanyl-related deaths beginning in about 2014. By 2022, there were 5,978 heroin-related deaths and 15,331 prescription painkiller overdose fatalities. but the overwhelming number of drug overdose deaths came from fentanyl, claiming the lives of 74,881 people in the country. And this is in just 1 year. So what exactly is the government doing about this? What's the response? Well, in response to the ever-increasing numbers of overdose deaths, the Department of Homeland Security has announced what they call a targeted strategy to combat illicit drugs. Their plan is outlined in a report titled Strategy for Combating Illicit Opioids and lists 4 main goals. Primary elements of the strategy include reducing the international supply of illicit opioids, reducing the supply of opioids in the United States, attacking the enablers of the drug trafficking organizations, and working with the private sector to better stop drugs from getting into the United States. Now, the DHS report highlights their international efforts to address organized crime groups and the supply chains for illicit drugs. As mentioned earlier, most illicit opioids sold in the United States are made with precursor chemicals originating in China that are then transported through a network of land and sea routes to Mexico and Central America. Eventually, criminal organizations in Mexico synthesize the chemicals into illicit opioids and meth and then sell them in the black market. Criminal organizations in China have an interest in both making and laundering money, right? So they also want to get that cash out of China, and that contributes heavily to the causes and origins of the fentanyl crisis in the States.
A US Treasury official tells NBC News that Chinese criminal organizations are operating in the US and now working with Mexican cartels by helping them launder money made from meth, fentanyl, and other drugs. They do so by loaning out the cartel's dollars to unsuspecting Chinese people living in America. These criminal organizations are then repaid in Chinese currency back in China. And the money launderers buy Chinese products and have them shipped to Mexico, where they're sold and give that money in pesos back to the cartels. In the end, no money actually crosses international borders, and the Treasury Department says the dirty dollars are, quote, disappearing into thin air. The DEA says instead of products like the clothes and appliances that were once widely available here in LA's wholesale district, the products money launderers are sending from China to Mexico are deadly.
Guess which product is very available in China that's not available here at all? Precursor chemicals.
Now, Homeland Security investigators within DHS have established relationships with partner countries, plan to build cases against transnational crime organizations based on the seizure of chemicals in the supply chain. The point is to basically prevent the synthesis of illicit opioids while gathering evidence needed for criminal prosecution. As the report notes, these operational expansions must be paired with appropriate bilateral and multilateral engagement. Homeland Security investigators will strengthen its relationship with the World Customs Organization and seek to leverage WCO enforcement capabilities to illuminate and target precursor chemical shipments, shippers, and brokers linked to illicit opioid synthesis. The reach of Homeland Security investigators is pretty vast, and they've been assigned to 91 offices in 54 countries, including, by the way, China and Mexico. In fact, the fact that China seems to be cooperating with the United States on this is pretty good news. According to the report put out by DHS, this strategy is already beginning to work. So in fiscal year of 2022, HSI narcotics enforcement efforts resulted in 11,612 arrests, as well as the seizure of 28,689 pounds of opioids, including 20,981 pounds of fentanyl and over 210 million in illicit proceeds. Now, domestically, the plan is to work with federal, state, local, and tribal partners to tackle the crisis. DHS will increase the number of Homeland Security investigations task forces, basically designed specifically to target the drug traffickers. DHS will also use cyber forensics to better target drug traffickers who cross the border and have a presence online. Now, based on DHS's detailed report on this, their entire focus is on international crime rings and domestic drug traffickers. There's absolutely no mention of criminalizing those who have fallen victim to addiction, and I think that is absolutely the correct approach. Domestic policy, which would need to be passed by Congress, and that's not a good sign, but nonetheless, should focus on heavily funding drug rehabilitation facilities, which are far too expensive and out of reach for most people. And while simply using drugs or simply being in possession of drugs shouldn't be treated as a crime, committing another crime while on or in possession of drugs should lead to prosecution. This used to serve as intervention for addicts in need of monitored detox. Because of the pendulum essentially swinging away from the ill-conceived drug war and toward a more loose, hands-off approach, those struggling with addiction are never compelled to get clean. If convicted of committing a crime, individuals should not be sentenced to prison, but mandatory inpatient drug rehabilitation instead. The drug war didn't work and had devastating consequences for some. But the live and let live approach ain't working either, because clearly more people are dying every year. Something has got to change. And I think targeting the origins of these illicit drugs and their traffickers is a good idea.
Thanks for watching. If you become a member, you get to watch all this ad-free, except for, of course, this ad. Still, hit the join button below.